Hello, I'm John Reisman, and this is Centrist News and Perspectives, where we focus on evidence, reason, and logic in order to decipher what we're hearing in the media and try and get closer to the truth. There are a lot of ways to approach this, and some of it is giving context to the news that we're hearing about on a daily basis. However, I wanted to introduce some ideas that will help us understand. One of them is sophistry. Now, sophistry comes from actually the Sophist, from Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates, and of course so was Aristotle and also Xenophon. But Plato wrote something called the Sophist, and this is used to describe what sophistry is. So to give us a good understanding, if not a better understanding of sophistry, let's first take a look at the definition. Sophistry is to use fallacious arguments, especially with the intention of deceiving. Now we know, or at least we believe, generally speaking, and beliefs can be very fuzzy and dangerous because oftentimes what we think is true isn't, and what we don't think is true is, mainly because of the level of rhetoric. Also our personal inclinations and cognitive bias, which we have to be very cautious with because to err is human, and we are in fact human. So sophistry we see, and oftentimes people just say, well, politicians lie. Well, actually that's false logic. That's like saying, well, I saw a guy wearing a pink shirt on a Friday, therefore all people that are men wear pink shirts on Friday. That's false logic. It also goes to what's known as false equivalence, which of course some politicians do use. I've known politicians that were very honest. For example, Bob Inglis, in my experience, was very honest in his depictions of what was going on, and he's no longer a politician. Go figure. So basically, we see a lot of things about fake news. Donald Trump constantly claims everything is fake news. Is he telling the truth? Or is he telling part of the truth? Because there is fake news out there. In fact, Donald Trump himself often is presenting fake news. Let's take a look at some of Donald Trump's ads for the 2020 election campaign to get him reelected, of course. First of all, note that these ads had notes placed next to them that were captions. That said, despite the constant stream of lies from the fake news media, my popularity is higher than ever. Well, the assumption, of course, is that is actually something Donald Trump said. Sounds like something he would in fact say. But who are in these ads? They're depicted as Americans. In one case, for example, we have Thomas. Now, Thomas is actually not an American. He's from Turkey. Thomas is saying, President Trump and his family and the administration are in our prayers for strength and wisdom from God Almighty. God bless. Now, what's interesting is one of the scenes in the ad actually shows a scene from Japan. And then it zooms into a man who's sitting behind a counter in a coffee shop. And as I said, Thomas is from Turkey, so he's not an American citizen. He's just actually some sort of in-stock photo image that the Trump campaign people picked. Now, another one is Tracey. Tracey says, President Trump is doing a great job. I could not ask for a better president of the United States of America. Well, Tracey is a model, and she's walking along the Mediterranean Sea, not an American coastline. So what we're seeing essentially from the Trump 2020 campaign is his fake news. And as I understand him, he fakes a lot of things, including his intelligence, but also his business acumen. Those are other stories. We'll get more into that later. And a side note on these fake ads that the Trump campaign is doing, you can actually see down in the corner of the photos where it shows on the ads. Mind you, it only shows it for approximately 2 seconds, a little bit less it seems. It says actual testimonial, actor portrayal. Now think about that wording. This is an actual testimonial said by someone, not the person in the photo, that is done through an actor portrayal. Now, this is a degree of sophistry that Trump uses quite a lot because there's lots of ambiguity in it. In other words, it could be an actual testimonial, but the individual in one of the ads said they were a Democrat. So let's think about that. It might be an actual testimonial from somebody in the GOP claiming or lying that they're a Democrat and then being portrayed by an actor. Whew. There's an old story called Plato's Cave about shadows on the wall and trying to get closer to the truth. I think even Plato just turned over in his grave. Could you be more confusing, Mr. Trump? No, that's your trademark, isn't it? Because you want to be able to say, oh, I didn't mean this or I didn't mean that. And that's what you say a lot. So we need to be very careful with what we understand as sophist. But we also need to understand what sophistry is on a deeper level. So I have some examples that came from the book The Sophist by Plato. And hopefully that will give you an idea of what we're talking about. Now in The Sophist, we have two characters. There's one Theaetetus and one the stranger. So Plato is using these two characters in a discussion about sophistry and what is real. So I have taken excerpts from the book, and not the entire book, of course, just certain pieces of it, and we'll do more on it later, but I just wanted to give you a few examples right now. The stranger says, but the art of the lawyer, of the popular orator, and the art of conversation may be called, in one word, the art of persuasion, and of argumentation. One sort wastes money, and the other makes money. Who makes money out of private disputation? Now, disputation comes from disputing or arguing. Theaetetus replies, there is only one true answer. He is the wonderful sophist. Yes, says the stranger, and with a fresh pedigree, for he is the money-making species of the eristic, disputatious, controversial, pugnacious, combative, acquisitive family. The stranger continues, when a person supposes that he knows and does not know, in other words, he doesn't know what he's actually saying he knows, this appears to be the great source of all the errors of the intellect. And this, if I'm not mistaken, is the kind of ignorance which specially earns the title of stupidity. Well, when people actually claim they know things, in an absolute fashion especially, which is somewhat dangerous because, as I said, to err is human, then that is that sort of special kind of stupidity. And a lot of these types of arguments come from us from Donald Trump and those that are of this kind, if you will, sophist. So what we'll do is we'll try and look deeper into how these people look at their audiences, in this case Trump's followers, and how and why they might be more gullible. There's a lot of psychology behind that, and we as humans tend to be quite gullible, some of us less and some of us more. So we must exercise some degree of caution regarding what we believe and don't believe as to why it may or may not be true. That might sound a little more difficult to think about than normal because everybody likes things in clean little lines and tweets. But the reality is, this is our future. We must, we the people, pay attention so that we can make better decisions about how that future will play out. So the stranger continues, and may there not be supposed to be an imitative art of reasoning? Is it not possible to enchant the hearts of young men by words poured through their ears, when they are still at a distance from the truth of facts, by exhibiting to them fictitious arguments and making them think that they are true, and that the speaker is the wisest of men in all things? Well, that sounds very much like Donald Trump. He's told us many times he's got a big brain. That doesn't actually prove anything, though. That's also false logic. So generally speaking, we need to be more cautious about what we believe when politicians like Donald Trump are talking to us, especially those of us that consider ourselves conservative. Normally, at least in the past, conservatives were supposedly careful thinkers, but everybody thinks they're a careful thinker. And that's one of the faults that we have to be very careful of. In fact, there's a psychologist named Christopher Chabris who's done some phenomenal work. He's a neuropsychologist. And what his work has shown is that, for the most part, what we think is true isn't. There's also something called the Dunning-Kruger effect that we need to pay attention to, which points out that we generally think we are correct when we're not. That means all of us need to be more careful, not just cater to what we think is true based on something that comes from what we think are trusted sources. Because many of the media sources out there are in fact there to make money. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to push ads and they're trying to grab onto people's minds. Well, normally that's done through populist argumentation, because what's popular to you, the audience of that station, it doesn't matter if it's Fox News or CNN or whatever. I remember, how CNN used to blow up reality by trying to make a small fire into a big fire or whatnot. But you see the same thing on Fox News. I'm not saying that all the news they put out is fake news, but they use some level of drama, and that's a dangerous thing. But you also have to parse the difference between, for example, when newscasters are in fact using populism or doing what's rhetorical presentation. You can look at Tucker Carlson, you can look at Sean Hannity in the Fox News area. And these are not newscasters, although sometimes they claim to be newscasters, but then when you challenge them on facts, they say, well, it's just my opinion, which means they're not being newscasters. That is a level of sophistry that can be quite confusing to us in and of itself. So it's important for you in the audience and me to understand, is this person presenting their perspective on truth or a contextually relevant analysis of what might be truth? And a lot of times these things are coming from some form of bias. So again, we need to be more careful. Let's talk about cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is the most famous name in the cryptocurrency area. Now, what's interesting about cryptocurrency is, first of all, it was originally sold to us as a method by which we could practically circumvent the government. In other words, they can't track where your money's going. So that's good for us, and that's usually sold under the auspices of a libertarian argument. I actually had a conversation with a friend from Paris who's very involved in what's going on in the cryptocurrency area, and he argued that liberty is more important, and I pushed back a bit, and I said, look, here's the problem. In the old days with just cash, in other words, dollar bills or francs or euros or whatever, you have to move large boxes of things to move large sums of money. You can always do it electronically, but that is traceable, and criminals don't like traceability. So Bitcoin was made so that it couldn't be traceable. That was its design. Now, why would we think that that just makes better liberty to have untraceable currency? The thing is, maybe that's being sold to us as a sophist argument, for example. In other words, if we believe it's all about liberty, then we miss the actual point of what it is for people that can take advantage of it, for example, criminals. Imagine this. Let's say you want to do something in another country and you're a dictator. So you want to move cash over to that country. You can't do it electronically. People will see what you're doing. But if you can do it in like with a submersible or any way you can move cash. They used to strap cash onto people's bodies and travel across borders that way. It's very difficult to move that money in relative perspective to, for example, an untraceable Bitcoin. But let's say you want to do something really big, so you want to move $1 billion, for example. Well, you can move $1 billion in Bitcoin instantly, silently, secretly. Basically, what cryptocurrency does do is it enhances the ability of criminals to move cash around the world to do more nefarious things. That's not good for the economy, that's not good for society, that's not good for human beings in general, because it enhances the ability to take advantage of the laws and circumvent those laws and borders to do different things. Any kind of crime they want to do. We don't know. They're paying somebody to go kill somebody. They're paying somebody to go rob a bank. They're paying somebody to go, spread fake news, for example, like as in the Russian 2016 election hacks, and everything they did. So cryptocurrency has a lot of dangers around it. Then we see, for example, Facebook coming up with a new cryptocurrency, Libra. Again, this is a way to circumvent, different types of traceability unless it's traceable. Now, if Libra is traceable, okay, it's a little bit better. But there's another argument we need to address. We need to talk about the fact that every time you add a new element to the economy for exchange, there's a fee attached, and that creates an inflationary aspect. So is it our job to not only enhance the ability of people to move money around the world, but to also make sure Facebook, for example, gets richer because they're taking that tiny little percentage off of every transaction you make in that particular currency, in this case Facebook's Libra? Well, that also has a downside. You've heard people talk about artificial inflation in the past. Every component that we put in between different components that is involved in the exchange of goods and services, aka capitalism, creates an inflationary component that might not be attached directly to productivity. It might be more attached to service. Now, sometimes you create a service so that you can make money in between phases of productivity supply chains. Sometimes that's advantageous, and sometimes that's usurious. So governments need to be able to regulate such things or not even allow them. We did see when Bitcoin came out, most governments said, no, not a good idea. We saw entire countries saying, not going to do that. They had good reasons. We don't want to enhance the ability of criminality, but we also don't want to increase artificial inflation components that make oligarchs stronger or corporations stronger, because that really takes away the power of the people in the ability to operate small business. It's a trend, and it's happening no matter what we do. We have to at least be aware of what's going on. Sometimes big business can be advantageous, because if you have a large business, you can move things at a cheaper rate, so to speak, so that you can actually get food to people at a more reasonable price than a small store. But those stores usually don't have the long reach into the small edges of the communities. So these are all economic things that we have to consider when we talk about currency and trade. All in all, what we need to do is be very cautious when we consider cryptocurrency. We already have ways to trade or move money electronically, and they are traceable. That makes them clean. If they're traceable, that means it's harder to do crime with that. So let's do it the way we've been doing it, with fewer fees and fewer middlemen, and less propensity towards increasing the capability of criminals. Let's talk about unemployment. Donald Trump claims to have the best numbers in history, essentially. But what's interesting is if you look at the graph, for example, you can see that President Obama reduced the unemployment rate from 10% all the way down to around 4.3% or so. And Donald Trump has seen a continuation of that. So the question then becomes, are Trump's numbers actually a result of the policies that President Obama put in place or things that he did? And it's probably a mix. But what is interesting is if you compare the amount since the day that Trump took office of unemployment reduction to the amount that President Obama did, Donald Trump has reduced the unemployment rate relative to President Obama, only 12%. Wow, well, that sounds like a big number. But like I said, it's relative. President Obama, relative to Donald Trump's number, reduced it by 814%. Well, that's a lot, okay? In fact, how much is that? Well, that's 67 times more. If you put it in percentage terms, that's 6,783%. In other words, President Obama did 6,700% better than Donald Trump. Well, I doubt Donald would agree, but those are the facts. Most of the unemployment reduction was done by President Obama since the 2008 explosion. That was, of course, the bad debt deal, and that was largely a occurred because multiple presidents made the mistake of not paying attention to collateralized debt obligations and hidden aspects of the market that could come back and bite us. And those things did. So it's really not fair, of course, for Donald to take credit for President Obama's work, but Donald loves to take credit for things that other people did. A lot of things you'll notice, for example, is when he's actually taking credit for things, a lot of those things were already in place, and then he takes credit for it. Well, that's also another type of sophist lie, but that's Donald. So let's talk about what's actually going on with employment in America. As we can see on this chart, the US population is 329 million. This is based on the last census. And the workforce now is 156 million, almost 157. The official unemployment numbers are 5.8 million, and the actual unemployed are 11.465 million. So the difference, of course, is, and the official unemployed is the one that is used in the unemployment numbers. The actual unemployed includes the total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons. The full-time workers means full-time workers are persons who usually work 35 hours or more per week. So the full-time workers is 130 million of the 156 in the workforce. That means we have about 25 million people that are working part-time. And all you need to do is work 1 hour a week to be included as employed in the official number. So that's a bit misleading because no one can live off of a few hours a week. Most people can't live off part-time jobs. Those individuals will have to be living with other people that can help pay the rent, also likely paying or having part-time jobs. I've talked to a few people that are actually involved in part-time employment, and they've said things like their employers try to make sure they never get enough hours to be considered full-time because they don't want to pay for their health benefits. Well, I understand that from a business perspective, it's great if you don't have to pay for things, but that's not great for your employees. It's only great for your business. And business exists essentially as a mechanism by which we can exist. So the more of us that participate more fairly in that economic structure, the better off we all do. Now, I've had some friends of mine who are conservatives that have argued with me and said, well, John, you know, people should be allowed to make whatever they want. And generally speaking, I do agree. But when you break down the argument into more specific arguments, such as how are they making that money, then I have more questions about how moral or ethical or even legal it should be. For example, back in 1976, there was a law called Buckley versus Valeo passed. When Buckley v. Valeo passed, it gave essentially people more of a right to spend more money on politicians. Well, that's interesting. When we saw that occur, though, we started to see a change in the amount of money that corporations made. Because if you can put more money into who you're influencing in elections, you can actually steer more money in contracts towards your corporation. So there might be a good connection between laws like Buckley v. Valeo and the amount of money that corporations made, and then of course increased their own salaries, which increased that famous 1% number. And I noticed this in IRS statistics, and I did a report on it, I don't remember, maybe around 2006 or 7. But the numbers do still hold. In fact, we have another chart here, and on this chart you can see the household incomes. And in the quintiles, you see the top quintile in the blue, and the black is the top 5%, so you have a cumulative number. But if you look at the bottom quintile, it's essentially flat. That's that green line. Then you have what's called the fourth quintile is the orange line, and those haven't moved very much. But you do see the middle quintile moving up, and that's income above 59,000. So the lower income areas haven't really done much, but the higher income areas like the top quintile, the second quintile is that sort of light purplish color, that went up a lot. So why did that happen? Well, it may be, and this is a hypothesis, I don't have direct connections, but it certainly seems likely that because people were able to influence politicians more by spending more money on them, they could control where those contracts went in the future. And that's one of the dangerous things to our Republican democracy, because if we're overly influencing where the money goes, then we're not participating in capitalism, we're participating in a type of fraud. And fraud is not capitalism. Transparent markets are capitalism. And claims of transparency in markets, that doesn't equal capitalism either. It has to actually be transparent, just as with Donald Trump when he claims he's the most transparent president while hiding everything from us. Now, let's put that in context. Donald Trump promised he would show us his tax returns. Now he is fighting in court to make sure we don't see them. That tells me something interesting. When he promised to show his tax return, he was lying. That's all there is to it. He has no intention of letting us see those tax returns. If he did, he would not be fighting it in court. And he is fighting tooth and nail. So let's stop pretending that he's telling the truth on these subjects. He's not. He's a liar. And that's how we have to all remind ourselves of, because he tries to make everything sound rosy and wonderful, like his trip to North Korea. He goes and meets with Kim Jong-un, and he walks across the border to make it look like he's the big, important guy, that the first president to walk into the North Korea since the DMZ was established. Well, that's optics. Well, that's fake news. Because guess what? He didn't gain anything for the United States of America when he crossed the DMZ. The only thing he did was make Kim Jong-un more powerful. And not only did Donald Trump do this for his own self, optics for himself to make it look like he did something when he did nothing other than change his views on North Korea. In other words, before he said, North Korea, you're not going to be a nuclear nation. We're going to make sure of that. Now he says, yeah, it's okay. You can have some nukes. It's okay. In other words, Donald Trump is under the influence of Kim Jong-un. That's pretty bizarre if you think about it. He's under the influence of Vladimir Putin. He's under the influence of Saudi Arabia. He's under influence of Kim Jong-un, all dictatorship nations. And he's trying to make America a dictatorship. There's no doubt that he's attacking the First Amendment. Every single time he calls the press the enemy of the people, he is walking all over the Constitution of the United States and the First Amendment. Every single time. With his brash breaking of the Emoluments Clause, the 25th Amendment, he's continuing to wipe his feet on the Constitution. This is not a law and order president. This is a wannabe dictator, and he's trying to move America more and more towards that dictatorship. Remember what he did in the very beginning when he became president. He created a new department in the Department of Homeland Security, specifically to track anyone that says negative things about the president, inferring, if not directly claiming, that anyone that says anything negative about the President of the United States, aka Donald Trump, is committing treason against America. That companies or reporters or anyone that says anything negative about Donald Trump is committing treason against America. This is not a president. This is a dictator. And we, the people, are the ones that are going to lose if we don't get rid of this dictator, Donald Trump. Period. I'm John Reisman, and this is Centrist News and Perspectives.